Coming out of the pandemic, there's a certain relief as professionals come through the triage intensity that they've had to contend with. The tension between resilience, requirements, the business model of many organizations being challenged by the economy, trying to drive productivity to answer the call on margin pressure. That is a very interesting place and difficult place for supply chain professionals to be. We need to continue to invest in transformation, continue to invest in compliance requirements while dealing with that backdrop. So it makes the supply chain professional really the centerpiece of the boardroom. So 23 is going to be a year where I believe big turns will happen in some areas.
This is Radical Reinvention, a show by 0100 about reimagining the world's supply chains. I'm Kevin O'Mara. I've spent 30 years working in supply chains. And in that time, I've learned a lot about how we move stuff and the people who move that stuff around the planet. I've also learned that supply chains don't always move with the planet or people in mind. That's why we're pushing the world toward 0% carbon, 100% digitized supply chains. This means a world where people's needs are met, but the planet is preserved. To do that, we're working together with the world's most innovative supply chain pioneers and industry experts to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing the planet today. And we're inviting all of you along for the ride. Join us as we work to create a more sustainable and responsible supply chain, one radical reinvention at a time. For today's episode, we're kicking off the new year with some supply chain forecasting. What can we expect to see in 2023? What are we excited about? What kind of surprises can we anticipate? And of course, since this is a 0100 story, we have to talk about the role digitization plays in it all. What will be the biggest stories around digital transformations this year? And what will they mean for the future of supply chains? Helping us unpack all of this are Angel Mendez and Matt Davis. Angel has had a storied career in supply chain over the last 30 years, heading up everything from procurement to operations for the likes of GE, Citibank, and Cisco. These days, he's on boards of numerous companies and organizations, including Kinaxis, Sleep Number, and Peloton, and is currently the executive chairman of the board of LevaData. He's also on the board here at 0100. Matt is our head of research here at 0100. Before he helped us get off the ground, he led content and community teams at Amazon and Gartner, and worked in the supply chain function at Dell. I'm excited to have them both here to look ahead at 2023 in supply chain. Let's jump in. Well, everybody, welcome to January 2023 Supply Chain Forecasts here with 0100's Radical Reinvention. I'm joined by a couple of very good friends of mine personally, but also of 0100's. Angel, I'm going to open up with a little question just to orient folks. You have joined our board most recently. I wanted to get your thoughts on why you joined our advisory board and what you hope to bring to us.
Absolutely. Happy New Year. Well, look, first of all, I think 0100 as an organization, as an idea, is something that is really timely and critical. Trends that we're bringing together here, digitization and sustainability, are undeniable. Number two, I think the community that we serve, we connect, is one that is naturally collaborative, as we've known for a number of years. And there's a lot to learn from each other. And thirdly, none of these problems can be solved by any single organization, any single government, and a single jurisdiction. These problems require collaboration, require best practice transfer, require just a whole body of research, and someone had to bring that together in an innovative and thoughtful way. And at the end of the day, supply chain is all about taking natural resources and converting them into value, into products that serve mankind. And I think there's no better endeavor. And the pandemic has really proven how interconnected the world is and how important supply chains are. So it's critical work.
Well, it's great to have you with us, Angel, and really look forward to what we have to tackle this year, which is quite a bit of stuff. And Matt, that brings me to you. You leading our content organization, maybe just a quick flyover of what we're going to be trying to touch on this year, not necessarily an agenda read-through, but what's coming up for 0100 in 2023?
Yeah, I think first I'll start by saying it's exciting to be celebrating our 1-year anniversary, or perhaps our 1-year birthday. We've learned a lot over the last year from a research perspective around the intersection of digitization and decarbonization in supply chain. And so I'd say looking forward, what we've heard very clearly from the chief supply chain officers, COOs, and their teams who are leading the digitization efforts is that digitization is really about tackling growth, resiliency, and decarbonization together as a collective, and perhaps having a much more integrated view on how those things can feed off of each other. Specifically, you could think through things like how tackling growth initiatives around the world, tackling what consumers need, customers are asking for with new digital tech solves and analytics will actually help organizations become more resilient. And through that resiliency, actually get more effective and efficient with their operations, which is going to have a positive impact on their decarbonization efforts. So from a research perspective, that's exactly where our 0100 team and customers are going to be looking at all of the tech, whether that be traditional technology and software, robotics, some of the hardware, or some of the new kind of quote unquote tech that we've been exploring with alternative materials, bioengineering, synthetic biologies, and some of this new tech that's making its way into the material side of supply chain. And so our perspective is to lead with the same perspective chief supply chain officers are having. I need to solve for my customers, for the board, for the CEO, the C-suite. And that means really zeroing in on business performance and then taking that back to how tech is going to drive those things forward.
That's great, Matt. Thank you. That's a pretty ambitious quest I think we're teeing up. And Angel, your coverage of the thought process behind why this is so important says we really have to step up to this stuff. Let's talk about this first segment. We are kicking off 2023. I'm going to come to you first on this, Angel, but if you were to pick the biggest single transformation or event or issue or change you're anticipating, what's the big one? What strikes you as the story of the year trying to guess ahead into the coming 12 months, the biggest transformation? And who do you think might represent the tip of the spear? Who's leading that? Any perspectives?
Look, I think in some ways, 23 is going to be pretty frustrating for supply chain professionals in the sense that coming out of the pandemic, there's a certain relief, if you will, as professionals come through the triage intensity that they've had to contend with for the last 2+ years. And I think in everybody's mind is this notion of getting back to some kind of normal and being able to operate their businesses in a more steady state sort of way and begin to really drive investments in transformation. I call it this transition of triage to transformation. My concern, however, guys, is that we're really walking into a year of very low growth economically, potentially a recession, with lingering inflation on top of that, and particularly in Europe, where you have energy costs really drive high inflation, north of 10% in many countries. But that combination of low growth and high costs or high inflation presents supply chain professionals with a real big dilemma because organizations are going to want to stimulate demand, and that usually means lower prices and high advertising expenditures and other pressures on budgets. And at the same time, they're contending with trying to drive inflation to drive those margins. So that tension creates budget pressure internally, which takes resources away from investments that are required for transformation. At the same time, they're seeing all the pressure coming from their boards and from their senior leadership to drive resiliency, to drive ESG compliance, and to drive digital transformation. So the tension between resilience requirements and at the same time trying to drive productivity to answer the call, if you will, on margin pressure, that is a very interesting place and difficult place for supply chain professionals to be. We need to continue to invest in transformation, continue to invest in compliance requirements while dealing with that backdrop. It makes the supply chain professional really the centerpiece of the boardroom.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think I've heard that from a lot of others. Matt, I'm going to come to you on this one. What are your thoughts about the biggest transformations we're looking at in 23?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. We can see each other here on camera. Angel has a pretty badass guitar hanging up behind him, and it reminds me of Angel and his band back in the day, rocking the supply chain conference. And it made me think actually sort of a long-term view on tech and where we've come and where we're going. And I think the big thing for me that's been super interesting is innovation around transportation technology and some of the investments that we've been talking about for well over a decade back when Angel was blazing those guitar strings. And things like robotics, automation, drones, AI, all of this EVs, electric vehicles happening in the tech space. There's a story about Microsoft investing in a battery material startup as part of EV innovation, shared all sorts of different statistics of basically government and industry coming together to stand up some of the infrastructure and the investments, particularly in batteries. This company is called Group 14 Technologies. And I think making some of those investments to actually propel EVs forward. This is something we've been talking about for more than 10 years. And then one of my favorite stories that came out as a former Amazonian and getting actually to work alongside some of their robotics and drone organization is just like right after Christmas, there was a story of Amazon actually doing some drone shipments in Northern California and out in Texas, starting to make some of that progress that we've been talking about for so long and actually doing direct to consumer deliveries. And it's only within a 4-mile radius of this distribution center, but hey, it's actually happening. And they've had some of the approval from the FAA to make some of that experimentation happen. Kevin, you've also highlighted that last mile innovation is going to be something really big in 2023 and continue to accelerate even coming out of COVID. But I think the main thing I take away from that is tech innovation, digitization, and supply chain is a long-term game. Some technology, some digitization might be on a 10-year horizon, but you've actually got to focus in and understand the different time cycles around some of these things. I don't know, Kevin, what do you think about sort of transportation, last mile?
I think it's big. I'm going to respond to some of your thoughts, but circle back to Angel's highlight, which is triage versus transformation. I do think we're past triage and into transformation, but I do think that the economic pressures are going to be severe. I think what you're asking with respect to transportation and the innovation, the tech and transportation, obviously the entire EV universe has got a huge amount of momentum in the minds of consumers and of businesses, actually arguably businesses even more so buying fleet. But that drives a requirement for infrastructure, which I think Angel was talking about earlier. Where does the investment come from for all of this? I actually think my top focus for the year in terms of the biggest transformation that's going to drive supply chain experience through the year is reshoring, which has started, has picked up speed. We're going to be hearing from folks from Cummins and from Volvo and from other big industrials about not necessarily reshoring to any particular geography, the US or whatever, but basically decamping from an overdependence upon China in particular. Not that there's anything wrong with China. In fact, they're so darn good at manufacturing. That's why we got in there in the first place. But as people start to reorient their manufacturing networks, I'm seeing this across industries, from health and beauty to heavy industry to food. There is a real chance to see a bump in investment. And we're getting a little bit of support from government legislation. The Inflation Reduction Act is helping certain folks to get going in things like renewables investments. But I think that that's going to be an opportunity, even in a low growth environment. Going back to Angel's point, I do think it's a low growth environment, but I don't think it's going to be brutal. But I basically feel like the requirement for infrastructure for all of this technology to take root, whether it's the transportation stuff you were talking about, Matt, or some of the automation and robotics that I think are going to be enormously sought after through the year, I think there's a little bit of investment, a little bit of spending coming out of capital investment. And yes, the interest rates are higher, but there is still cash on the balance sheet.
Well, I think it's important to elevate a little bit in this conversation for a second and recognize the difference between things that are macro trends that have been moving for a while, that may have been accelerated during the pandemic for sure, or the consequences of the pandemic, and things that are more temporal, right? Things that will cycle through in typical economic cycles. Matt recited a number of things that I fold under the topic of supply chain innovation. And I think broadly speaking, the supply chain innovation environment has been exploding for quite a while. If you take something like supply chain or logistics visibility, for instance, the venture investment in visibility has been climbing since about 2013, 2014. Something like $15 billion of venture capital has gone into that space and created unicorns and created platforms that we now sort of take for granted, you know, the FourKites and the Project 44s of the world, and the larger players like Amazon making huge investments in that space for their own use, but also ultimately for marketing through AWS, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We should all recognize that we're living a wave of supply chain renaissance when it comes to innovation. The pandemic helped it, because by definition, being such a wide and all-impacting crisis, it puts a very large spotlight on the opportunities and the gaps that organizations have that need to be invested on to improve and drive resilience. Kevin, your point about reshoring is driven by many aspects, but resiliency being one, but also geopolitical reality, right? And that is a force that is also probably going to be a little bit more long term than not, and that'll continue. So all of these things compete for investment. And then you have ESG, right? So you have all of these things intersecting. I actually think of all of these things, automation, things that save labor or automate the need for labor are going to be high priority this year. I think people are, in general, not talking enough, Kevin, about the realities of labor shortages in the economy. And this is a function of many things, but I think that's going to be a continued inflation driver, and companies will strive to automate. You're going to see a lot more robotics. Your former company, Amazon, is a great example of trying to invest a lot more on automation. I think you're going to see AVs begin to really show up in the trucking space and be very material, and robotics in general in many industries.
Yeah, the macro drivers are really, I think, aligning beautifully to have technology, which has been, I think you're quite right, of course. The venture capitalists flowed into visibility tech, and some of the stuff we've seen in robotics and some of the stuff we've seen in analytics using machine learning, artificial intelligence for analytics, it's all exploding. The thing is, it all feels like it's coming home to roost at the moment. We're not just looking for a little bit more blood out of the stone. We're not just trying to get a little bit more efficient. We're trying to reinvent stuff. And I think the automation component, that's a really broad term. It might be things like autonomous vehicles for long-haul trucking, solve the trucker shortage. And then when I think about what's going on in manufacturing, yes, you're right. It has to do with de-risking, and it has to do with geopolitics, and it has to do with, I think, a big picture trend in the way we design work. I think there's this meta change which has occurred, and that is capital and labor is your classic production function, and for the longest time we sought lower cost labor. That offshoring wave, which started in the 90s, I think it's finally hit its end. And what we find ourselves doing is, how do I design everything from an automation-only McDonald's through to drone deliveries of consumer products to someone's doorstep? And the cost of robotics is coming down so rapidly at the very same time that the requirement or the value prop of investing in this is going up. So I think it's frustrating, to your original point, Angel, because we're going to have to deal with growth reductions in the year. But I think that the saving grace will be a quest to reinvent things, and therefore heads of supply chain who are able to think big about where the investments might solve the labor problem, might solve the risk problem, might solve the visibility problem, they're going to get, I think, a longer leash than has traditionally been the case. But if you step up to this challenge, I think it's a win.
It absolutely is. So you go back in time, supply chain officers were fighting for relevance. That train left the station. That's the good news for those of us that have been a fan of the profession for a long time. The bad news is that it's time to step up, and it's going to require a different level of skill set and a different level of influence in terms of fighting for the right investments and budgets and priorities, and to step it up to the accountability, which goes with the territory, right? While I'm concerned about 23 in terms of that tension of resiliency, fighting for investment versus productivity and responding to the macro environment, I've never been more bullish on what's possible. And the other thing that we haven't quite mentioned yet is how easy it is for new capabilities to emerge. Years back, when you were trying to invest in systems, it required a tremendous amount of investment. It required a tremendous amount of time. It is so much easier to rev up API-based services in an IT environment now to really move data around, to get visibility, to do analytics, to apply AI to large swaths of data. You have to have the competencies internally to know the difference between good and hype, but there is a tremendous opportunity to shorten the time between gain capability, if you will, whether that be around visibility or that be around planning. One area I'm super excited about is the connection between PLM systems and what people do to the design products or design formulations or design products of any kind, and the actual supply chain processes that basically catch those designs and make them real and consumable. That connection between those two worlds has not really existed in a very effective way, and I see that as an opportunity. So sourcing data, for instance, risk data, compliance data, can enter the design conscience of an organization far earlier in the design process so that you can design resiliency in and design compliance and design sustainability, and systemically do it so that engineers and designers and operators can shake hands in a much more effective way. So I find that to be a huge opportunity, whether it's a pharmaceutical or whether you're a hardware manufacturer.
Hey, Kevin, do you mind if I jump in quick just to reflect on Angel's point on labor? And I think, Angel, when you were talking about the labor pool, what's happening in supply chain, it popped into my head. I recently read two articles. One was from the Washington Post, and it said these buzzwords have changed how we talk about work in 2022. And the buzzwords were things like RTO, return to office, things like quiet quitting, productivity paranoia, boomerang employees. I found there was a common thread actually to these things, which is people are seeking meaning in their work. Do I find my work meaningful enough that it's actually interesting to come in and do? And maybe for the first time ever, supply chain has that recognition broadly in the market across all the different fields and is in a place where the work itself is interesting, it's complicated, it's hard, it requires knowing operations, but as well knowing the tech space. And so then the second article I read right after that was about Gen X. My friends know I'm a very proud Gen Xer. And so what Gen X is like, we are the forgotten generation. That's what the whole story was about, is every story is written about, here's Gen Z, here's what's happening with millennials, and here's boomers. And it's like, there's a whole generation of people who is Gen X, who is the forgotten generation. But I think what's super interesting when I connected those two things together is seeking meaning in work and supply chain as a meaningful career seems to resonate with every single generation. None of these articles are specifically about Gen Z and supply chain or millennials. Everybody right now is thinking about meaning. And I think something exciting for labor and that I think everybody in supply chain should be out doing is the work is interesting and it's problem solving. And there's now a whole suite of technologies that's making this like the profession to work in. And so while there is a labor shortage, I think, happening everywhere, part of this is selling the story of why the work can provide so much meaning every day when you go in, when you're working in supply chain.
I mean, I think the return to work issue continues to evolve. I don't think we've arrived at the solution yet, if you will. I think companies are still somewhat experimenting. On the other hand, we've seen evidence now that 100% remote is an innovation risk. It is clearly a collaboration risk. It's clearly a culture risk, to your point, Matt, about people wanting to find meaning in their work, but also meaning with each other and being in community. The question will be, how do we then interpolate the needs for flexibility, right? Where people gain in some ways a lot of flexibility by working at least partially from home. But I can tell you the companies that I'm involved with have all seen a common thread, and that is that particularly in software, particularly in innovation related roles, compliance to schedule suffers, creativity suffers when people aren't together. It's that X factor of people running into each other in the building, chemistry that occurs when people are finding ideas randomly, or when teams that are in effect a working unit are unable to riff, to use a musical term. And that's a crunch that is very visible in things like software milestone compliance metrics and things of that nature that are beginning to suffer. So I think the pendulum has, as we've seen in large companies, begun to swing back with some pushback from employees in some areas. I think we'll settle somewhere in the middle where there'll be some form of best possible hybrid that each company will have to find.
I fully agree with where you are landing on all of this, Angel. But when I think about tech transformation, and in particular, when you started getting into the question of what I think of as product lifecycle management, the linkage between product design for X, as we used to describe it back in the old days, designing a product and then hooking that to its implications for how it behaves downstream. The sustainability performance of a product is locked in before it leaves the drawing board. Tech transformation is exciting because of the pace at which you can roll this new stuff out and how much tech gets rolled out by teams who are ops teams and how quickly it changes the way the business behaves. And what I think is exciting is if I'm going to design my process to have better face-to-face interaction and better capturing of that learning between my designers, my R&D folks, my product conceptual team, and my sourcing folks, my compliance folks, my manufacturing process engineering folks, part of that has to be personal, but part of it has to be more than just we get along great. We actually record it. And this is classically stuff like, what does the product data management system contain? How much visibility is there to my sourcing environment if I want to do things like change management, or if I want to provide for more attribute flexibility in what I'm designing into a bill of materials? Angel, what I'd love you to respond to is, if we're going to work better together, but we're going to take advantage of tech, what's possible with some of the new tools that you've seen in terms of keeping that pace of innovation up, but harnessing it in a way that it's systematic. Angel, what do you think about that?
One side of my organization was very large software development teams around the world that were moving quickly, responding to innovation requirements. You want to create the opportunity for teams to innovate quickly and try things and put things out there beyond an MVP and work with customers in real time to develop the technology. And the other side of my organization was running around trying to catch non-compliance, right? And trying to make sure that we could pass a cyber audit by one of our customers and trying to make sure that we were properly certified and controlling cloud consumption costs from the cloud providers. And so that tension requires that leaders that are in a senior role allow for enough loose environments to allow for innovation to flourish, but you cannot let it go amok because there's obvious risks to the product, to the customer, and to the company. And that is not a simple solve on a daily basis. You have to put systems around it. I can assure you that our friend Torsten at Honeywell is constantly in a debate with the CIO and Chief Digital Officer on how to manage that dilemma. But that is the tension, right? That is the tension. At the end of the day, there are audits to pass, there is compliance to achieve, there's cyber risks that have to be managed. Obviously, you can't let costs get out of control. Now, what I'm encouraged by is the burden to some degree to sustain that environment transfers over to the suppliers, to the vendors of cloud services, for instance, to provide the tools for security and compliance so it make it easier for that tension to be solved on a daily basis. But the velocity that's available now to rev up capabilities is fantastic and also risky. Not enough supply chain organizations have an internal innovation team. They are still going to the IT department for help, or they're relying on suppliers or consultants. There's a lot of digital transformation consulting being sold into supply chain these days by the likes of Accenture and Deloitte and many others who are very capable at it. But internally, they need to control their own destiny. And if I were back to my old days as a chief supply chain officer, I would have formalized innovation in a more direct way. We did it. We didn't call it that. But I think it's important. So it's a big area, and I think it'll continue to be something we talk about.
Taking some of the responsibility for innovation on tech into your own hands as an ops leader is something we can all buy into. We did some research on this in the past year. Grow Your Own Citizen Technologist seems to be one of the hottest takeaways from the Skills 2030 report we put out. But I want to come to you, Matt, on the question of more broad tech. In other words, things that are outside of what we classically worry about in supply chain. Things that are driven by, let's say, social media or the metaverse or ChatGPT, which picked up 1 million users in 5 days, or TikTok. If we want to be good at taking innovation into our own responsibility as ops folks, how do we take account of these other tech trends? Any thoughts on how we think about non-supply chain oriented tech and how it affects our supply chain strategies?
Yeah, for sure. A piece of research we put out in June of 2022 around trending supply chain terminology. And I think one of the interesting things from that analysis was some of the slowing terminology were things like digital collaboration, machine vision, virtual simulation, and some of the growing terminology was drones, robots, cobots. But far and away, the most breakaway term was around digital twins. And so the idea of being able to do simulations and representing your material flows. I think Tesla helped move people forward and understanding that there's thousands and thousands of digital twins just out being modeled as they drive the streets. But I think what was interesting is what aren't people paying attention? And I think it is social media. And I think supply chain needs to get a lot more customer centric and demand centric and to start to really embrace and perhaps own the demand chain side and start thinking about the sell phase, the use phase. How do we connect with customers and feed that back in so you have this infinite loop like you've so often talked about? And I feel like social media, the TikTok supply chain is just sitting right in front of supply chain's face. And in my opinion, we're not perhaps paying close enough attention to it. The days I was at Dell and Oprah would do her favorite things, we would be able to predict our demand spike based on what that show might look like and arrange our materials ahead of time to try to have the best customer experience. Imagine that, but live and completely out of your control based on what's starting to trend with some of the influencers and what they choose to talk about. That's the upside opportunity that I think supply chain should probably pay really close attention to. And then as we've seen is there's a whole other risk side, which is perhaps consumers maybe not having as much information about your supply chain and getting out and spreading bad or false information or things that could really impact demand. And with the complicated multi-tier supply network, being able to respond to customers in a clear way and an effective way and in a way that you feel that you can actually trust the information. The story where there was a consumer products manufacturer with diapers. I think, Kevin, you've talked about this. There was a whole rumor started that there was glass in these diapers. And, it could take 2 to 4 weeks to actually trace that back to the factory and then go to the exact lot size and get the material information. And by then, the story's over. And so I think that there is this offense, defense around social media that supply chain needs to really zero in on in 2023. And as you started to coin it, our customers have started to say the TikTok supply chain is perhaps going to be one of the biggest disruptors or opportunities in 2023. And it's supply chain who's going to determine the fate of how that all turns out. So I think that's the big one to keep an eye on.
I want to get your thoughts on something which is word of the year. What we saw when we closed out 2022, we did a similar podcast with another board member, Mark Angel, who sits on the board of directors for Maersk. His word of the day looking backwards was abnormalization. And I want to take this forward and think about year 2023. My word of the year for 2023 is adapt. It's not very fancy, but actually, Angel, when you kicked us off on this conversation, I was thinking in terms of, boy, if I'm in the world of ops in any company from food to aircraft, and I'm entering this year with what we know to be expectations of a recession and yet lots of pressures to keep on moving towards the new opportunities as they arise. I want to be opportunistic. I want to jump. So what I'd like to be able to do is adapt. If I get a little window of opportunity and someone's going to start forking over some money to build some new infrastructure and I can be part of that deal, I want my supply chain to jump on it. Or if I have some social media blip, to Matt's point, that all of a sudden this product is flying off the shelves, I'd love to be able to adjust my production and distribution to not miss the orders. Angel, do you want to go first on this one, your word of the year for 2023?
So let me give you my preface, and then I'll tell you what my word is for 23. I'm big on rubrics and frameworks. I think of the supply chain officer, the operator's agenda for 23 as 3 legs, if you will, of a triangle. On the one side of the triangle, you've got this need for productivity because of the need for margins. On the other side, you've got resilience because we have this incredible need for supply chain risk management improvements and all of what came out of the pandemic. And the third leg of the triangle is what I think is this innovation agenda, right? Is keeping an eye on the future and some of the things that Matt talked about in terms of emerging technologies and things that matter. If you're a logistics-heavy organization, you're going to care potentially about AVs and long-haul trucking and so on. If you care about high labor content, you're going to care about robotics. In the middle of this triangle, you've got sustainability, right? You've got compliance. You've got the things that companies must do because their stakeholders demand it. So if you think about 23 and you think about being in the chair, you're operating a large organization, you're trying to balance those 3 legs of the triangle, which one wins in 23? I think my word is productivity. As much as I'd hate to say it, because I think innovation is where the fun is, and I think resilience is where the lessons from COVID come, but I do think this year, I would argue most industries are going to be under significant economic pressure. And so how do I do more with less? How do I invest carefully in my other priorities and still deliver on my budgets? So my word is productivity for 23.
I think you're on it. What do you got, Matt?
Actually, I think, Angel, you triggered something. I'm going to adjust my word of the year. I think at my core and at the core of 0100, we're optimists. So I would always guess that our word of the day is going to be about the opportunity that's out there in front of you. We all know Davos is coming up, and a theme for them is cooperation in a fragmented world. So I was like, oh, hey, I'll go down this path of ecosystems. We've been talking about collaboration, collective action, and what that means for the industry. And then I was like, oh, no, that's been around. But actually, I think what the analysis on my end highlighted for me, and actually I think Angel just reinforced, is that supply chain just has too many priorities right now. And there's so many things you could do. And it's complicated and it's hard. And it might be the easy way out to say, let me show you this beautiful strategy I have that tackles every single possible scenario in the world. But I think the winners of 2023 are going to be those who are ruthless about prioritization and actually pick the 2 or 3 things that they could do incredibly well. And I think those 2 to 3 things will be digital efforts and digitization across operations, but to do those things just flawlessly well. So I guess my word of the year for the industry is going to be simplification. To not get distracted by all of the problems, but actually pick the things that are going to help the most for customers first.
Simplification, productivity, and adapt. Those are our 3 words for the year. And I think they actually hang pretty well together. What you guys have brought to this conversation is a level of strategic thinking about what ops leaders, supply chain leaders need to be able to do in their daily work and in their leadership roles. Angel, you said this earlier, but making supply chain relevant at the board level, I think we're way past that, as a matter of fact. All of the characterizations you've laid out in terms of what's on the plate. I think the likelihood that supply chain excellence versus supply chain errors is the cause of a company's success or failure, I think that's more likely this year than ever before. You'll either be short on supply, or you'll be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or you'll somehow be unable to deal with the challenges that are out there. You won't be resilient enough, you won't innovate fast enough, you won't be productive enough, and you won't prioritize properly. That's the chance, I think, that comes with being in a position of leadership that supply chain has found itself in these most recent years. So I look forward to this year, and I think in terms of 0-100 in our mission, 0% carbon, 100% digital, that digital transformation is really the lever that we're all getting our hands on. There's a lot to be done, but it feels like a golden opportunity for those who have their heads around these things at a strategic level. So I'm going to finish us off here and thank you both for some really great insights and some great perspectives. It's really a treat, and I sure look forward to seeing how 2023 plays out and how well, as an organization, we help work with this community to try to tackle some of these giant challenges. All right, friends, there you have it. That's it for Radical Reinvention Episode 6. Thank you to Angel Mendez, a supply chain legend and 0100 board member, and to my colleague Matt Davis for sharing their wisdom with us. You can find the links referenced throughout the episode in the show notes. 0100 community members can check out all of our full interviews online at 0100.com. See you next time.
This episode of Radical Reinvention was produced by Kevin O'Mara, Catherine Perry, Mike Silverman, Diane Hope, Brian Egan, and me, Victoria Marin. Matt Davis contributed research insights for the episode, and Ko Takasugi Chernovin is our sound engineer and also composed our theme music. To find out more about 0100 and to check out our content library, go to 0100.com. If you're interested in joining our community of contributors, send us a note at hello@0100.com.